Hello everyone, liebe Grüße aus Wien. I am very pleased and very honored to be in Vienna today with Martin Sellner. Martin, first of all, thank you very much for accepting this invitation.
Bienvenue à Vienne.
Dankeschön. So, my channel is generally aimed at a French-speaking audience, but exceptionally we will be doing this interview in English, both because it's more convenient for us, but also because it's the best way to spread Martin's ideas across Europe. But anyway, there will be French subtitles, of course, under this video, and probably also in other languages. So don't forget to see in the settings to activate the subtitles.
I would also prefer to speak French, obviously. It's such a beautiful language, yeah. But
Thank you. I would like also to make it in German, but I fear my German is a bit rusty, and well, it would be best for our spectators.
We switch to the language of globalism.
Exactly, but to fight it inside
Of course.
So, I recently devoted a long video on Martin's book about remigration, Remigration, ein Vorschlag, in which I presented your ideas. And indeed, it's this word, remigration, is now the term everyone associates you with. So we will be talking about remigration, of course, to a large extent, but I would like also you to speak a bit more about yourself, about your background, about your ideological influences, and maybe the right wing in Austria. So I will be asking you these questions in the first part, maybe, of this emission, because you became a prominent figure of the identitarian scene in the Germanic world, Germany, Austria, but I think you are becoming more and more well-known outside of your country. So my first question would be, how did you come to embrace these ideas, these right-wing ideas?
I have to say it started very early for me. So I was, I think my activism, my first demonstration started when I was 14 years old. So
Okay.
It's been a while, but back then there was no identitarianism. It was, I would say, the old right, like more subcultural right in Germany. It was called back then freie Kräfte, nationaler Widerstand, natural resistance. I don't know if there's an equivalent in the French scene, but I think, you have like national revolutionary movements. And basically there I made my first political experiences, which were more subcultural. But as soon as I also started to really think deeply about those issues, and I was always interested in philosophy, I was brought up with an interest for that in my home, my household. And I then discovered, I would say, like the richness of the conservative revolution. Plus, and I really have to give it to you, like the French people, the Francosphere, because what we were searching for, and we're looking around for alternative ways to voice our anger, to do real effective activism. And then in 2012, it like hit us, it struck us when we saw this amazing action in Poitiers by Génération Identitaire.
Yeah.
We immediately drove there. I remember we were in Orange at this big meeting, and we basically got the license to create a franchise in Austria. So it felt a bit like that. And then we created the first identitarian movement in Vienna, Austria. It quickly spread to Germany. And from then on, since 2012, identitarianism, identitarian activism, but also this deep connection to France has been a big part of my life.
Okay. But did your family... was your family already a right-wing family? How did you get acquainted with these ideas? Is it from your parents, from friends?
I'm very grateful for my upbringing, my parents. My parents are conservative, very Catholic.
Okay.
So, but politically, it wasn't a political upbringing. So it's very clear values, like clear also gender roles, very conservative structure, and obviously patriotism, heroism were things we looked up upon, the stories of our heroes and our saints. But politically, my parents, for example, never voted for the Freedom Party. So the Freedom Party was a no-go.
The FPÖ.
The FPÖ. They were more like UMP in France, the ÖVP here,
the classical
CDU,
right.
The classical Christian conservative centrist party. The Freedom Party was like kind of a no-go. It wasn't our...
But it existed already. When was it created?
It existed already, and I was born in 1989. I'm old. I'm a geezer, yeah. But Haider was already very big, and I know that my parents really didn't like him. Yeah, so that was basically my upbringing, and they also changed their mind. By the way,
your parents support your actions now?
Yes, they support what I do, and very grateful for that. But back then, this was my upbringing, and I was interested in politics, and obviously also like to provoke. So I provoked my dad a bit with left-wing ideas, you know. So that I heard it's cool. It's cool. I provoke people with conservative ideas from home. And at some point, I found out I could provoke both sides by being extremely right. And this was, my parents really didn't like it when I was going into the scene. They were afraid for my future.
Of course.
And obviously, like, I mean, I had a house raid when I was 17 years old, you know, so these things also piled up. But for me, it was also an adventure, an act of rebellion. And I would say I had this value set from my parents. This brought me into this hard alt-right scene, but at some point it also brought me out of it, because I always was looking for something, for a political vehicle, a political movement that expressed and materialized these ideals that I had. You know, I was also reading Plato like very early, and I had this idea, okay, there are some ideals, there are some truths, and I want to fight for them. I want to do something for them. That was something that really struck with me. And I once read like a diary entry for me when I was 14, 15, where I was writing about this. Obviously, it's a bit cheesy now to read it, but it still resonates with me. Yeah, that still is my goal. I want to live an honorable life, and I want to fight for these values.
And was it already from the beginning the conscious of the Great Replacement? Of course, at the time we didn't call it the Great Replacement, but the mass immigration starting at that time that made you go more and more in this direction? Or was it more the values, the philosophy behind the right, and then you became identitarian in that sense?
That's a good question. I would say it was the latter. But there was a very interesting biographical fact, because a childhood friend of mine was brought up in Vienna. My parents moved out of Vienna, typical white flight, because already you saw this, it was already happening. And then in the city where I lived, beautiful enclave, you know, like very nice, obviously quite expensive, because all the left-wing people move out there. I think you have the same phenomenon in France. Yeah?
In France, Belgium, it's the same.
In my school, there was no foreigner. Only the whole school was only Austrian, but everybody was a left-winger. Everybody was against the Freedom Party, or teachers were hardcore left. But then I saw the life of my friend. He was almost the same age, and he grew up in Vienna. Suddenly he started talking like Turkish people. His German became a broken German. He was hanging out with them, and I saw how he basically became a gang member of these gangs. He told me Austrians are lame, Austrians are gay, we always beat them up at the schoolyard. And I asked, okay, well, you're an Austrian. He says, nah, I'm not. So, and I saw how he was changing and how this environment was completely different.
It was like an inverted assimilation.
Exactly, it was an inverted assimilation, and I just saw that we are living in this bubble. And that's what I really disliked. So we're living in this fake bubble, and these people are just closing their eyes. They're just basically living on this little island where the rest of the people is drowning. And then we had a very big asylum center very close to this town. So I was confronted with this reality, but I was not confronted in a way that I couldn't avoid it. I could have easily avoided it. Just, going to start in Vienna, going back here, international career, just avoiding it. I think it's the same for you. You know, if you want, you can just evade this.
Many people do.
Yeah.
They really blind themselves with this reality.
So for me, it was the latter. It was these values, these ideas, and it was a direct confrontation.
Okay. And what was the place, and what is the place of right-wing ideas in Austria? And both at the time when you started your engagement and today, because if I'm not mistaken, it has been very hard to identify oneself as right-wing in Germany, at least until now, or maybe still today. But how is it in Austria? Is it very different?
It's very different, yeah, because in Austria, we didn't have this deep re-education / denazification. So in Austria, patriotism is something very normal. In all the European polls, Austria ranks among the top 3 to 5 when it comes to national pride. Austrians are very conservative, especially outside of Vienna. And also, if you look at the Freedom Party, Jörg Haider, right-wing populism was started in a way in Austria, parallel maybe with the Rassemblement in France.
With Jean-Marie Le Pen.
With Jean-Marie Le Pen, I think it was a dual thing. And I would say Austrians are very conservative people. But at the same time, activism wasn't something typical for Austria. So there weren't really right-wing activist movements next to the political party. So this was something completely new. And it's also new to the Austrian, I also would say even German mindset. The French are revolutionary people. They just like to build
like
barricades,
to strike and
storm buildings, you know. The reason why comes later. There has to be a commotion. And in Austria, people are a bit more lazy. You know, like Lenin once famously said, if the Germans do a revolution, they want to occupy a train station, they will all buy tickets before, you know. So that's a bit of the tough issue here. But I'd say in terms of values, Austria has been right-wing patriotic and is becoming more and more patriotic and right-wing. But the ideology, the ideological state apparatus is just as left-wing as in Germany. So the artist scene, the universities, all of this is
media
completely occupied. Mainstream media, so there's no difference here at all. And setting up like a political movement was a bit of an issue in Austria because you had this huge dichotomy where activism was only this old right, like very attached to the Third Reich, to its icons, to its leaders.
It was still very important in this subcultural scene, yeah?
Before GI, it was the only thing. There was no, like you had this diverse plurality of groups in France and in Italy. In France, you have like Action Française, you have monarchists, you have the
traditional Catholics,
Scoutisme.
Yeah,
didn't exist in Austria at all. So if you were an activist, you were immediately and automatically in the subculture of music, clothes, commemoration days, which was very closely attached to National Socialism. So that's what we call the alt-right, and this was something that was very heavily persecuted in Austria, very isolated from the population, had no political impact.
Of course,
as you say, on the Freedom Party, because they were also like the only thing that they were somehow rallying for was to lift this law in Austria. There's a law, it's called Verbotsgesetz. It's a completely crazy law. Like you go up to 10 years to prison if you just basically show a swastika somewhere. Yeah. So
it's the same in Germany, no?
Yeah, but in Austria it's even heavier. In Germany, there are certain symbols that are banned. In Austria, it's a very broad definition. It means if you do anything that could reenact National Socialism, it's 5 or 10 years, you know, which is like the highest thing we have in Austria. And so there are people like 10 years in prison right now just for having runes on a candle for their children. So it's very crazy situation. And so I think the whole right-wing activist patriotic camp in Austria was kind of a deadlock. You have a very hardcore political movement, completely detached from the majority, and then you have this right-wing populism by Al-Qaeda, which was growing more and more, I would say, liberal and mainstream from its value set.
And so you would say that the identitarian movement, in a way, in one part of it, was also a way to get out of this ghetto, of this subcultural ghetto, and to explain to the right-wing scene that you should not be a caricature of themselves. It's
like Philippe Vardin said, you know, one of the thinkers of the identitarian movement said, we should make our enemies afraid, not our grandparents. That's a quote I really like by him. And it was this dichotomy. Either you're a Nazi or you have to be for the Great Replacement. So this was the dichotomy. There's nothing in between. And obviously people had to decide. And then when we were young, and I was young, obviously you hate what's going on, you dislike it. You see they spit on your heritage, they replace your population, or this is already going on. And then you do what is the most extreme no to that, ego non. Yeah. But this wasn't the best way. And
so because you didn't have any, it was the only alternative.
It was the only alternative. And that's actually, I think, what they want. So they want to create this dichotomy. Either you're with us for white guilt, for Great Replacement, for a genocidal ideology, or you're the worst, extremist, crazy caricature. And everything that's in between, they don't like it. And so what we did and what we did with GI, we focused on the main goal of right-wing, which is preservance of the ethnocultural continuity. Here we have no compromise. So we're very clear and very focused on that, demography, but that's the only thing what we really focused on, you know, and we don't need any cliches, any fetishes, and that's what we stood for.
That's true, yeah.
And we talked, like Camus, we had talked about Camus as well. And this was also an impulse from France. It wasn't only the style, the activism, it was also this term of the great replacement.
We'll, of course, speak about it probably a bit later in the emission when we'll speak about your other book, Regime Change von Rechts. But I guess it was also a way to start to think politically again. Exactly. And not just being in a kind of folklore, just enjoy even being in the ghetto.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm not like punching right here. I think this law should fall. I think everybody should have the freedom of expression. I also think if you had freedom of expression, it would be like in America where you're free to say all those things, but still they don't get that much traction. And everybody can decide what they want to do and what they want to represent. But I think it was important to create this new space. And as you said, think political. Create a strategy, see what you really have an effect, and not live in this kind of political existentialism where you do something because it feels great and you like it, and then in the end you become like a biker gang.
Yeah,
I would say it's like the Hells Angels nationalism. You have a small group, completely isolated from your own people, especially in your area. You have your little chapter, and nobody knows you, likes you, and they're all afraid of you.
And you even enjoy it. Yeah.
You enjoy it. Yeah. No one likes us, we don't care. And then you know the other chapter that is 2,000 kilometers away. You have great relationship to them. You know the Hells Angels in Norway. Sometimes you meet up, exchange flags, make a cool event, make cool videos, make cool poses with your jackets.
And you have the impression to be part of a kind of secret elite, or you understood everything better than all the others, etc.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another question that I wanted to ask you was about the nouvelle droite, the neue Recht, as you say in German. So I think all the viewers of my channel, they know very well what is the nouvelle droite in France, with people like Alain de Benoit, Guillaume Faye, Dominique Venner, of course. But there is also a German
poster here on the wall.
Yeah, there's a poster of Dominique Venner here. But there is also a neue Rechte, a German new right. And I think it's the people composing this new German new right are not very well known in France. Would you say it's more or less exactly the same, but in German, or is it different? I mean, did this new right take other orientation on different subjects? How did it evolve in Germany?
It's a very good question. Actually, we could make just a single video about that.
Probably, yeah. I would like to make one.
But I would say, yes, the German new right is very different. I would say it was always less cultural, also less pagan. So this
you don't have this kind of dichotomy very strong that there is.
Exactly, it was less pagan, but also less Christian. So in France, it's very concentrated. You have like Académie Christiana, you have the Scoutisme, you have a very explicitly French Catholic groups, and some of them are even like Gallicanistic, so with a
tendency. Yeah.
Yes, and then you have this like very hardcore pagan people who really take it seriously and very much in that direction. There's a dichotomy. In Germany, I would say that the new right was obviously influenced by German thinkers like Armin Mohler, Ernst Jünger, Armin Mohler, the legacy, rediscovering all of our own things like Spengler, the Conservative Revolution, and this already gave it a nuance to all these issues and these topics. And obviously the most important figure of the German new right is Götz Kubitschek, my publisher, from the Verlag Antaios. He kept up the legacy and the idea of I would say, a revolutionary right, a right which is very clear on the question of ethnos, critic of modernity, critic of mass society, so no compromise here, but also clearly not NS. So this was the thing. Like they were talking about Stauffenberg. They were clearly talking about the secret Germany. This was the idea
from Stefan Georg.
Exactly. So this was the whole. I would say like they are a bit like the film Fahrenheit 451. We have this secret society of the readers who just meet to keep these books alive. So what they did, they called it also Secession. So they went away from the Junge Freiheit.
Yeah, the newspaper.
Exactly. And why? Because they went away from the Junge Freiheit, which was the mainstream, more liberal conservative newspaper. And they went away and said, okay, no, we want to have the pure, the unfiltered conservative revolution. Okay. We want to keep this up. We want to maintain this. And then they went there and had the academies. They republished the works. And but they had no activist movement attached to them. They were very disattached from all the activism going on. And then, in a way, there was kind of a match made in heaven, because when we created Generation Identity, when we went to Orange, Götz Kubitschek and Martin Lichtmes, main figures of the Deutsche Neue Rechte, drove with us there. Okay. And there, basically, we created a cooperation. Intellect and action, brain and fist in a way. And so we became the street movement, street arm of German identitarianism, New Right. And they also, I think they also thrived with the AfD and the whole movement. The academies get bigger every year. And I would say this is a bit like a very short story of the German right. There are a lot of other people like Hepp and others and Moller. There's a great book by Benedikt Kaiser coming out where he talks about the German New Right. So
and it will soon be published in French.
You have to read it. It's an amazing book. And there you have a more detailed history. So this was just a very...
Okay.
And the Jung Europa Verlag, obviously, from Benedikt Kaiser, now is another additional publishing house on the German New Right, which is also publishing here. And now there are many other smaller projects popping up, so it's expanding now.
So you would say that the identitarian movement in Germany and Austria are clearly a branch of the Neue Rechte.
Yes.
It's like the action part of the New Right.
100%, yeah.
Okay.
Also very deliberately, because we founded them from the scratch. So we found them from the scratch as an activist movement based on the idea of the Nouvelle Droite.
But to what extent the German activists, the identitarians, or even readers of the Antaios Verlag know the books or the theories of Alain de Benoit, Guillaume Fay, Dominique Venner? Are they really influenced by them? Or it's just, like a vague, they recognize more or less same intuition, but they don't know each other so much.
If they read at all, they read it, definitely. Yeah. So there are obviously those people who don't read. Most activists, not most, many activists don't read, and they also don't need to read. Not everybody needs to read theory. Not all of us need to be theory cells.
Of course.
Yeah. But those who read, yes, of course. I would say the three names you named, definitely. Pour une critique positive, which has been translated to German, absolutely, it's on the reading list. Then Guillaume Fay, definitely very influential thinker. I really also personally like him because he's more pragmatic in many ways.
Was the Archaeofuturism translated in German?
Yes, Archaeofuturism was translated, but by a different publishing house. But here, I think most people read it in English still.
Because Octos made a lot of translations, true.
Exactly, and then Benoit. I think the big opus magnum by Benoit. Maybe not everybody read it, but there are some shorter books like The Critic of Human Rights or Wir und die anderen, and some other texts that I think every right-winger in Germany who is interested in theory has read. I have to say, even to an extent where this has been read more than the German classics of the conservative revolution.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
More than Armin Mohler himself?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think so. And maybe also more than Spengler, because they're a bit
very large, also very hardcore book.
Yeah. And at the moment, if you want to find something boiled down to the core, then these French classics are really I wouldn't say unmatched. There's also great literature in Germany, very good books, obviously, about that. But it's definitely not just a meme, not just name dropping, but people do read it.
Okay.
If they read.
Of course. And yourself, people see you more as an activist, a man of action. But if I'm not mistaken, you also studied philosophy. What are your main influence, your favorite philosophers or political theorists?
I would say Heidegger.
Really, Heidegger?
No, it's Heidegger is philosophically is my I would say my focus.
Okay.
But obviously, when it comes to political theory, to religious studies, there are so many names. Mircea Eliade was also very important for me, very important thinker. There are many other philosophers. Obviously, I love Plato, Aristotle. It's really a very long list.
Mircea Eliade, that tells probably a lot about you. Are you very interested in the metaphysical questions, religious questions?
Yes, of course. It's my philosophical question is the question of being. And of course, the question of being is also a theological question that's intertwined.
For Heidegger, it might be surprising for our audience because, well, few people read Heidegger except people who are really into philosophy, because it's quite hard to read. So maybe it's not the first name people would have in their mind when they think about the main activist for remigration. But of course, we'll not make an emission about Heidegger. We could speak about it for two full hours. But what is so interesting for you in his works?
I think Heidegger is the original conservative revolutionary thinker. Why? Because he is definitely very revolutionary. So he talks about the destruction of classical metaphysics. There's a huge critical potential. In his philosophy, he has basically already all the ideas of modern relativism, all the turns, the linguistic turn, historic turn, you all can find it in Heidegger in a way which also is way more radical than Nietzsche. But, and that's a conservative thing, I think he does way more to conserve the real question and the quest for truth, philosophia, the love of wisdom of European philosophy. So obviously Heidegger himself wasn't kind of a Christian or not a nationalist, but for religious ideas, for ethno-cultural identity, his philosophy gives the best basis, especially because also way more than Nietzsche. I think like the Heideggerian right is I would say there's a coexistence between the Nietzschean vitalist right and the Heideggerian right. It's a bit like maybe the trifunctionality. It is like the Brahman type, the priestly type is more like the Heideggerian type, and the Kshatriya, the warrior, is like Nietzsche. Yeah? But of course, the warrior and the Kshatriya cannot make philosophy, so you should like shut up when it comes to the real philosophical values. But to finalize it, Dasein, the concept of Dasein, the critique of the neuzeitliche Subjektivismus, the modern subjectivism, which is, in my opinion, the core of Heidegger, and which rejects liberalism, communism, all these modern ideologies, if you really read thoroughly, and gives a perfect basis for what we understand as ethnocultural identity. Dasein, for me, is like the center of his philosophy, and it's also the basis for conservative right-wing thinking.
Very interesting. Have you been first Nietzschean and then you became Heideggerian, or was it always Heidegger?
No. It was first hardcore Nietzschean. Like I had to write 2 bachelor theses. The first was hardcore Nietzschean, and then I discovered in the university library a book, Heidegger's book on Ernst Jünger.
Okay.
It was, and I just wanted to read it because I wanted to post some cool quotes about Heidegger. I said, cool, book about Heidegger, Jünger. Heidegger was a bit of a right-winger. So yeah, let's see. Yeah. And then I just wrote through this book, and it was a very, very brutal critique of Nietzscheanism, vitalism. And what Heidegger says, I don't know how familiar you are with him, he says Nietzsche is also a metaphysician.
Yeah, it's the last one.
The last one, because he has a will metaphysics.
He inverted Platonism, but he's still part of the same history.
And it's true, like Nietzsche's philosophy is, he claims he's beyond truth, but what he wants to tell you is the truth about truth. He claims he's beyond morality, but he always makes moral arguments against the slave morality. So somehow there's a hidden metaphysical, classical moral framework here. And so I love Nietzsche, and Heidegger obviously is unthinkable without Nietzsche. But I think if you want to see the light, you should level up from Nietzsche to Heidegger.
So now we'll speak more about remigration, your main fight today, if I can say. I think today you define yourself, I heard you said so in some videos, you define yourself as a remigration activist. Well, the first question will be big, but I have to ask it. What is remigration according to you? Like, how would you define it? And why is it so fundamental according to you?
I would say remigration is actually quite easy. We stay, they go. So, no, I wrote a book about it, and I think also a great book by Jean-Yves Le Gallou. So
yeah, that will be published. So just to say to the viewers, the book of Jean-Yves Le Gallou will be published soon in March. Your book on remigration was translated in Italian already, and it will be translated in English, if I'm not wrong, and also very soon in French by our common friend Julien Rochdy, which I say hi.
Portuguese in Spain also.
And Portuguese in Spain. Okay, so
yeah, I think it's important. And actually, there should be every second week a book coming out about this issue because it's so important. It's the most important issue. Why? Because the biggest problem we have is the great replacement. Everything boils down to that. And that's also where I make the difference between like right-wing populists, parliament patriots, reactionaries, so to say, and real progressive identitarians. The first only talk about the side effect of the great replacement. They talk about the ecological costs, they talk about the criminality, they talk about Islamization, which are all symptoms, but they don't talk about the real illness, which is demographic replacement, birth rates, replacement migration, and facing the problem means you have to come up with a solution. And remigration is the answer, as the great replacement is that it's purely descriptive fact. Remigration is the prescription. And remigration means shutting down all the ways to illegally enter Europe, obviously, Fortress Europe, completely reforming the asylum system plus the citizenship system, like in terms of naturalization, needs to be stopped, cracking down on legal immigrants. Every legal migrant and foreigner who's not contributing to the nation, a cultural, economic, criminal burden also has to leave. And then when it comes to the third group, which are non-assimilated but naturalized citizens, obviously they have the same rights. And remigration isn't chaos. Remigration doesn't mean like voluntarily taking away citizenships and deporting citizens. That doesn't work. This would be the end of the legal state. It would be like the same as if we would declare anarchy or martial law. No, but it means to create the Restore UK, Restore Britain calls it a hostile environment. I would say incentives. Incentives for people to voluntarily go to a country which is better suited for them, and cutting off all pull factors for people who hate this country, who just profit from it, who Islamize it to stay here. And
what kind of incentive do you imagine?
There are incentives to go home, for example, by giving people just a cash payout. So the state can do this. In Sweden, they do it.
So like in French, we call it aide au retour, like help them coming back to their homeland.
Exactly. And if you look at the cost of the average MENAPT migrant, the Middle East, North African, Pakistan, Turkey migrant, during his lifetime for the state, because they're net negative for the state. And then just really a very short amount of this money you could give to them. And if they go home, it's paid out to them when they are home. And
but do you think, do you think it would be, is it the only kind of incentive you have in your mind? Because of course I can imagine that some people coming from a certain country could clearly accept this incentive, but some others coming from countries that in war, for example, who even with the money would not want to come back to their home, I'm not sure it would work perfectly fine.
I agree. So the incentive alone, just the money isn't enough. What you also need to create are safe spaces and areas. So part of my concept is a network of charter cities where we Musterstadt, we rent a space in North Africa. They have a lot of space there. They need money. You can rent it for 100 years and then you create cities there. You can even make different approaches. There are a lot of theories about private charter cities. And then you create schools there, mosques, you create sports halls. People can live there in safety. They can live there until there's peace in their homelands or until they rediscover the national identity, because we have all these people who are not deportable because they've lost their passport or the dog ate their passport and they forgot where they came from. And that's why we cannot deport them. But if you have these spaces and you need to create a network of the cities in North Africa, people can live there. Obviously, they're not locked in there. Left wing also say, it's like a ghetto. No, of course not. They can leave anytime they want, but not to Europe. So this would also solve this problem, an issue when people cannot go home or you don't know where they come from. And then here we have to create an environment which is hostile for people who are hostile to us. One clear example, so that obviously de-Islamization, cutting down social spending, and one clear example in Austria, when they banned the burqa, there was an immediate remigration effect of several dozen families, migrants, but also citizens leaving Austria because they said, when the burqa is banned, I don't want to stay here. And if you combine this,
I think it's a good point, especially like fighting the Islamization. If you make it harder to live their religion, in like for forbidding the burqa, maybe forbidding the halal or things like that, well, people who would like to live fully their religion, it would be an incitation for them to leave or to go to a different country.
Exactly. And also if you cut down social spending, then these people will not have these huge families anymore because they cannot afford them. And if they want to have them, with this money, with the incentive, they could have them in their own homelands way more easily. So you need to create an environment which is completely different, because at the moment we're giving the completely wrong incentives. But obviously this, in the third group of non-assimilated citizens, would be a long-term process. And the stress is here again, because there are a lot of court rulings going on in Germany right now. Every citizen is obviously equal before the law. I don't just say this for the camera. That's the basis of a legal system. And if you change this, then you actually are calling for anarchy and for dismantling the legal status.
Yeah, it would be opening the Pandora box if you go against this principle.
Why? Because it's called isonomia, like the equality in front of the law. Yeah. And if I say now, okay, I want to take away the citizenship of like 2 million people because of factor X and Y, then the left would say, okay, tomorrow we will take away 3 million citizenships from people who are not integrated to democracy because they're
voting AfD. Or
yes, like because they have radical ideas. So obviously this basically means civil war. It means if I'm in power, you will never be able to get in power back again. It means shutting down democracy. It means creating an authoritarian state. Well, if people wanna rally for that, that's their choice. But then you shouldn't mask it behind these things. So that's the way it is. It's unfortunate, and I think it's a huge guilt of the boomers and the other generations that they have burdened us with this huge amount of immigration, that they have thrown away our passports like candy, and now we have these huge parallel societies of people who don't identify as French, hate France, only have the interest of their tribe or even their homeland in mind, but have the same rights as you. It might be that this whole thing crumbles and breaks down into a civil war scenario at some point, because it's completely, it doesn't work. It's dysfunctional, but remigration is the only peaceful and legal solution to stop it, revert it, and defuse this ethno-religious time bomb. It's a ticking time bomb. Defusing a bomb is hard. You have to be very difficult. It's a very complex thing. We can do it. We have a plan for that. But if you just let it go, it will explode. And remigration actually is the only thing that can maintain the legal system, can maintain rule of law, and prevent a civil war.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And what I like in your approach is really this, you try to present a rational discourse on this topic, because for many years, and I'm not criticizing it, I think it was very useful in the first place. For many years, the identitarian movement, or just supporters of this idea on the internet, were making memes, with the planes or things like that, making some easy jokes on the internet, and maybe it was useful because it made it popular. It made the idea popular, and I'm very amazed to see that now more and more we are speaking about remigration, even to some extent on mainstream level. Of course, to criticize it, but we speak about it. Eric Zemmour spoke about it, spoke about creating a ministry of remigration in his last campaign. Of course, he didn't win, but he spoke about it. He made it known. And when I think about it, 10 years ago, when I first heard about this word, it was really something very obscure, in internet ghetto, and it seemed it would never come out. So now it came out, and what I like in your approach is that you really explain that it's not something very easy. We just don't take everyone, put in planes. Actually, it's really a long-term process. You have this expels, but it's also a reform of the asylum system, the nationality, etc. And what is important also for people to understand is that it's a long-term process. It will take many years, probably.
Because it also took many years to come where we are. So I think the three categories, like illegals, legal immigrants, and non-assimilated citizens. I think it's very good to think in the three categories. It systemizes everything. Are different approaches. That's why I differentiate them. And obviously the first two are quicker. I would say like the first would be 5 years, second about 5 to 7, 10 years, and the other would be really decades. But if we set all of this in motion, France will get more French every day. What I also have to say, because it's a French audience here, it was the French who invented the term in the political sense. It was the document, I remember it, I think 20 measures for a politic of remigration, a folder from Generation Identity. I think it was Jean-Louis Catin or the office who did it. And this was way before the term entered the Germanosphere. So we took it. The first remigration banner was in 2015, when there was this huge migration crisis, and we had to popularize it. But I have to say, I have to give credit to the French people. They were the first to use it in a political sense.
You will show how to put it in action.
No, in France, obviously, like Eric Zemmour, it's also very well alive. It's a bit unfortunate that today the term is not used. Also, I think the Restore movement isn't using it. But here, it's a very good point for me to say, I'm not a word fetishist. I don't care about words. If tomorrow we come up with a better word that works better,
of course, Renaud Camus is speaking about decolonization, for example. If this term is being used more, we will use it, of course. And
also, I'm not claiming that I'm a monopolist. So the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, NZZ, called me Mr. Remigration. I take it, But I'm happy that there's a new book coming out. I'm happy that there are people in the UK who have a more radical stance on remigration, and people who have a more softer stance on remigration, because we need this debate. We need an open debate. And Adorno once said, we must not leave the critique of enlightenment to its deadly enemies. So we must critique it ourselves. And I always say we mustn't leave the critique of remigration to its enemies. We must be the best critiques of remigration.
To refine it and to even do it even more precise, better.
Exactly. That's what I also hope when my book comes out in France, the French right-wing intellectuals read it, analyze it, criticize it, and improve it.
Actually, you became, you were already a prominent figure in the Germanic scene, but since the Potsdam meeting in Germany, when was it again? It was
November 2023.
23, exactly. People started to speak about you all over Europe. And after this meeting, I remember there was a huge demonstration in Germany calling for banning the AfD. I think the German government even tried to ban you from entering the country. Which
I was banned from Ender to several months, but I sneaked in.
But how did you experience this event? And in the end, do you think it was even good for you and for the ideas of remigration?
Yes, I will answer the last question first. By the way, I have to just clarify, this is not beer. It looks like beer, but it's Club Mate, which is an Antifa left-wing lemonade.
But it's very good. So we're doing some cultural appropriation.
We have a fridge here full of Club Mate. So after a sip of Club Mate, I will go back to Potsdam. So Potsdam was an attempt by the left-wing cartel in Germany to completely destroy the idea of remigration, to either ban the AfD or put them in submission, that they completely distance themselves and decouple themselves from identitarians, from their own youth movement, and from this whole new right ideology. So this was the thing, and that's why they came with, I would say, the political atomic bomb. Like, they compared this meeting to the Wannsee conference. Completely crazy, but they were able to trigger mass hysteria. They were, I think it was the biggest demonstration movement in Germany since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, maybe they exaggerated, but it was really crazy. Like, there were hundreds of thousands of people off the streets, like waving their smartphones, singing their songs, like in rituals, like like a cult. And they all were hating on me. So I was the evil guy, like Emanuel Goldstein in 1984. That's a bit how I felt, like the enemy of the state. But the whole thing obviously was completely untrue. And now there are a lot of media rulings against this media. They lied and lied. I call the whole thing the Protocols of the Elders of Potsdam. A little joke, because they claimed it was a conference. It wasn't a conference. It was basically a pitch meeting where a few people presented their projects to people who wanted to maybe invest. So there were like several projects. I was invited to present my book, which wasn't even remigration, but this one.
Okay.
Remigration wasn't even written back then. And I just mentioned it in a few questions. So it wasn't about remigration, and there was nothing decided there. It was just a very loose meeting, cigar club meeting. And then they claimed that we planned the mass deportation of German citizens there. So it was lie upon lie upon lie. The whole thing crumbled quickly. But what it really achieved is it made the idea of remigration famous. And since the AfD did not distance itself, although a few people really wanted to do it. So I think they also had the liberals in the AfD, the cucks, ready for this. Maybe they were even warned before. It was very hard. We had to fight very hard. A few idealists risked a lot. but we withstood the storm. We kept our ground, our metapolitical ground. And so it was a huge step towards normalization of the idea. And in the end, the only thing left is advertisement. The book became an Amazon bestseller in Germany. And you know the scene, you know the movie Pirates Caribbean?
Yeah.
Johnny Depp?
Of course, yeah.
So there's this famous scene where the guy says, "You are the worst pirate I've ever heard of." You know what's the answer?
No, I don't remember.
But you've heard of me. And that's a thing with remigration. It's the most radical idea that Germans have heard of, but they've heard of it. And that's something which is in the attention economy completely like the highest value ever.
Yeah, so, Jean-Marie Le Pen used to say that bad advertisement is still advertisement.
That's true. That's true.
And I think it's a valuable lesson also, but maybe we'll speak about it a bit after. But I just stress it out so that we don't forget. It's a valuable lesson that the AfD didn't back off and supported you, because well, I'm not sure that the Rassemblement National would have.
I wouldn't call it supported, yeah, but definitely yes, they did not back off, and this was only possible because the good people in the AfD, and especially the base of the AfD, pressured them in a positive way.
Okay.
And encourage them. Yeah.
Interesting, but we'll talk about more about it later. I would like still to remain on remigration. So you had this conference at Potsdam, then you wrote this book, Remigration, and it really became your main topic, Mr. Remigration, as you said it. And you go always a bit further. Last year, you and some other of your friends, European friends, not only German, not only Austrian, you organized the first Remigration Summit in Milan. It was the first one, the first edition, and there will be one each year, hopefully, if I understand it correctly. The new edition will be on the 30th of May in Portugal, in Porto.
Exactly.
What is the goal of it? What is the aim of this Remigration event?
It's an answer to Davos, an answer to the World Economic Forum. It's an answer to what the left is doing. They have a perfect network. They're always networking on an international level. And nationalists, patriots, very often lack this European perspective. And this was also part of generation identity. We're a pan-European movement from the beginning. We always said, okay, we are European. We understand it's about Europe, our continent. We have to work together. And unfortunately, you know, after the ban of GI in France and all this repression, this European perspective and this European network crumbled a bit again. So it really decreased. This idea of integration of European right-wing parties, the flow of communication went a bit back.
Yeah.
There are great things like Iliad, which is uniting a lot of Europeans.
More and more Europeans are coming every year.
It's really important, very important to have this. And the Remigration Summit also wants to achieve this. We want to unite and gather and concentrate all remigration activists, influencers, politicians once a year. We want to honor the people who did great work. We want to shame the people who betrayed us. Just kidding. And we want to create an effect of synergy. That's the main reason for that. And I'm very proud that the people who organize it are part of an identitarian European network connection, like groups from Germany, Switzerland, French activists, obviously, Danish people, so Portuguese, Italian people. So we are regrowing this European identity.
So the goal is really to create a network.
Exactly. The goal is to create a network. It's also what I'm going to do with my institute. That they have the young global leaders. We want to have the young European leaders. We want to form and educate the next generation of politicians, of influencers, of journalists to be focused on remigration and to be based.
Yes, because you also founded so the Remigration Institute. You gave me your card, but I don't have it right here. But I'm very curious to know exactly what it consists of, because I saw the video you made on Instagram presenting this project. Is it linked with the Remigration Summit? Is it like the think tank linked with it? And what is your goal with it?
It's part of the remigration universe. The remigration. Yes, it is definitely linked, but it's focusing more on, I would say, the typical think tank environment. Data aggregation, visualization, policy building, strategy. So, you know, I'm now also not in the age of an activist anymore. A bit too old for that. Maybe, you know, I'm still going on demonstrations, obviously,
Yeah.
but then I think the youth has to also be led by young people, and that's why you need the next generation
to pass the fire.
to pass the torch, exactly. And so we will focus on concentrating, aggregating, visualizing all the data we have about Islamization, great replacement, and also to show how remigration will take place. We have a very concrete project there. I think will be unique and has not been there like this on the German or European scale. We want to connect and brief all the promising young influencers, intellectuals, politicians. I have a very good network. I'm quite known, so it's also easy for me to create this. I see it as a responsibility. I want to use this to harmonize and unify the message. So we have a very clear strategy. We see where is the European metapolitical landscape right now. We go deep into the analysis. We make a landscape of all European parties, European movements, the European media, which are the best right-wing media houses. All of this doesn't really exist. There's no real headquarter and strategy hub. And then we're going to see what have you achieved, what worked, what did not work. And then we're going to have a status quo of the metapolitic overtone window in the European countries and Europe right now. And then we might have a goal, where shall it be in the year 2030? That's what we want to achieve with European-wide campaigns. So we'll be also touch a little bit into the area of activism, with briefing, consulting, with our own dossiers and our own publications. So I would say it's a metapolitical special force we want to create, which also then would be obviously supporting Remigration Summit with data and presentations, and would be helping out movements like Generation Identity. Because when I was in Generation Identity as a leader, this was something that we always lacked. Data, campaign management, research. I think this is the missing piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so it's really a European project so that people, for example, in France would benefit from the experience of German, Austrian, or vice versa.
Exactly.
And also, is there a plan or a project to create a kind of, I don't know, a common program for all the right-wing or identitarian parties across Europe about remigration?
Yes, I'm spoiling a bit, a few spoilers. Yes, exactly. That's also a project we're working on this right now. It will be as an answer to the UN Compact for Migration, the Compact for Remigration. We will take the best ideas from all the programs, with ideas from my book from Jean-Yves Le Gallou, the Great Deportation Policy in the UK, because all of this thing is so fragmentalized. Europeans act, French people act like there's only France. Germans only see Germany. We have no idea what great ideas are in the Polish migration policy, what great ideas Orban's legal advisory team has brought up. We'll harmonize all of this. We'll create the European Remigration Compact, and at the end of the year, we're going to rank all right-wing parties and politicians how well they're implementing this. So there'll be a ranking and rating, kind of remigration Oscars, because American think tanks on the right are doing this all the time. The pro-life movement, the NRA, the National Rifle Association. They have this checklist, like what do these politicians answer to that question? Would they allow AR rifles, yes or no? So there's kind of positive pressure from the right for right-wing politicians not to cave, not to cuck, not to give in. And with this institute, we want to create exactly this. So if the IFR, Institute for Remigration, gives you the remigration seal of approval, then you're based. If not, you're out. So, I mean, I exaggerate a bit, but this is somewhere we need to go. Obviously, there will be other institutes as well. I know that a lot of think tanks are in the verge of being created. I think it's kind of a gold rush even, because finally the right-wing people understand that this is the missing piece. We have right-wing media, right-wing political parties, we have right-wing activists, but somehow it still doesn't really work. There's no unified strategy. There's no unified message. On the left, you always have it. Refugee welcome, gender, climate. They always say the same thing all the time, immediately. Why? Because they have this think tank in the back who are only focused on message control, unifying the message on a strategy. Because you as an influencer, you as a politician, you as an activist, you don't have the time for that. You're completely engulfing your work. So you have to have this strategic level, and this is missing on the identitarian right.
It's true. It's really the coordination.
The coordination is missing. So we have so much resources and not enough organization. So I don't even think we need to convince the others right now. I strongly believe in the Pareto principle. I think these 20% who are already convinced right now, if you organize them the right way, if you divide the labor the right way, we can unleash so much energy, so much potential that we can just take Europe by storm, democratically and peacefully, metapolitically, of course.
Of course. And well, maybe it would be spoiling a bit, but if you were to already judge the political parties today in Europe, to which one are the closest to your ideal political program, which party or which country would it be?
Obviously, we need to make a difference between Western Europe and
Eastern, of course.
Eastern Europe, because there are different issues, and it's easy to give Orban like the medal, but they have different issues and problems.
About Poland, of course, they're more conservative, but they can support remigration, but it's not as vital as it is for us.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
Of course, let's compare the.
I would even say, like in Poland, Fortress Poland would be the main policy, like Fortress Hungary, because they don't have so many in already. Like obviously, remigration is very important for them. And I know a lot of Polish patriots who are also very interested in that term and who are focused on that. I think also around the big patriotic march, there was a conference focused on remigration.
Each year in Warsaw.
I would say, like, it's a bit, I have a few metrics already in my mind. I also don't want to spoil the whole thing. But in terms of like consistency, in terms also of political potential, because if you're a very small party with a great remigration policy, but you have no power, obviously,
Of course. Yeah.
It sounds a bit bad as Austrian in Vienna, but I think it's a freedom party in Austria. I'm sorry. Hands down, it's like, because, they have like...
Are you objective?
Yes. 39% in the polls right now.
With a clear program of remigration?
Yes, with a quite clear program of remigration, which is, in my opinion, one of the best. So if you, for example, look at the remigration report that the Freedom Party Youth has done, they also had a page that showed the demographic tipping point. In the remigration program of the Party Youth, it's very clearly stated, I can send it to you. So I think this is one of the best programs, but Restore is a huge concurrent. So if you want to have the remigration Oscar, you have to hurry up, because Restore is really catching up. And of course, La Reconquête, also amazing program, great party. So,
but it's contrary to FPÖ in Austria, Reconquête is much lower in the polls.
That's the issue, unfortunately, but maybe they can influence the Rassemblement National in that direction.
Pull it to the right.
That would be
it would be the purpose of this party.
But wait for the ranking. It will be very scientific. We'll have a jury of journalists and experts who also rate this. So it will not be just me. We'll have a jury of people who are quite neutral, and we also want to create a fellowship program later with people in France and Italy to make it really international. So that obviously the office will be in Vienna. At the moment, we're in the seed funding phase to see how big the operation can get. We have huge, the vision follows the budget. If the budget is high, we can become huge, but it depends if Elon Musk will bankroll us. Let's see.
Okay, and just a quick question before we move on to the other book. Compared to the FPÖ, how would you rate the AfD? Is it very close? Are the two parties very close by their action, program, ideology? Or the situation is so different in Germany compared to Austria that the two parties are very different?
First of all, to understand the difference, the Freedom Party in Austria is as old almost as the Austrian Republic. So the third camp in Austria has a long tradition. Even before Haider, it was a small party, but then Haider introduced right-wing populism. So you have even in the Rassemblement, you have a party nobility, families who since generations have been part of the party, and then you have all the fraternities who are the backbone of the party with the intellectual human resources, and that means they are way more accepted. So if, for example, Antifa would attack a Freedom Party booth during the election campaign and hurt the people, it would be a national scandal. With the AfD, it happens almost every week and nobody cares. And in Austria, there already have been coalitions with the Freedom Party. The Conservatives did it, and even the Socialists had a coalition with the Freedom Party. It would be like a coalition between the Socialist Party, la Parti Socialiste, and the Rassemblement National. Unimaginable, or Reconquête, So that's something in Austria that's very different. And I think in Austria, the Freedom Party obviously has this on their side, but also the negative aspects of being such a party for such a long time. So when you see how deeply identitarian ideology and ideas are in the party, in the Freedom Party, it's not that good. So Kickl is amazing and his team around him are amazing, but before Kickl, under Hofer and Strache, the Freedom Party wasn't really a good party. And there's a risk, I wouldn't say it's a huge risk, but there's a risk that at some point the Freedom Party could very quickly go into more like a Geert Wilders or more like Rassemblement National, very superficial, right-wing populism, sacrificing everyone, distancing them completely just to get into power.
You think it's a tendency that exists? Yeah?
It's existing, and I could go deeply into that, but the only reason why the Freedom Party is not yet in the government is Herbert Kickl understood it wasn't the right time. But a lot of people wanted to have these posts, have the money, get in power. It was a very hard internal fight, and if there were a government, it would be a very bad situation right now.
Okay.
And in Germany, the AfD is obviously newer, which
10, 15 years.
Super young party, and this gives them a lot of potential. The youth of the AfD is very right-wing because it recruits from the Sumer online right. And I would say that even though they don't have a Kickl at the top right now, they
have figure like Björn Oecker, who's very hard on the right. Yeah?
They have Höcke, they have Helfferich, they have Haseloff. I could name you like now 20, 30 names. Christian Berndt. They have so many amazing people who are so smart, who have read so many books, who go to the Schnellroda Academy, so real idealists, who had an economic career, who don't need politics, but still do it out of idealism and bring all this. So they have so many great people, even on the second, third, and fourth level and on the ground. So that's what makes the AfD, in my opinion, even a bit more resistant to this tendency towards parliamentary patriotism, because their base is so good and these ideas are so deeply in the party.
I see. So actually, it's nice transition that we spoke about this FPÖ and the AfD, because I want to speak also about this other book you made, Regime Change von Rechts, and I will show also the English translation, Regime Change from the Right, subtitled A Strategic Sketch. And actually, to be honest, I found this book really interesting, even more than the book on remigration. Remigration is vital, it's fundamental, it's very important. But from an intellectual point of view, the other book interested me more, because you delved really into the strategic thought, both classical and modern, even in being interested in some leftist authors like Antonio Gramsci, of course, the one we think about, but also Gene Sharp, for example, and that was very interesting. And I think it's something that it's a bit rare in the right intellectual sphere. We speak a lot about metapolitics, of course. In the new right, it's a very important topic. Even the word itself, metapolitique, was coined or reused by Alain de Benoit, Guillaume Fay, etc. But we speak a lot about these ideas, but we don't really theorize the way we put our ideas into action, and that's what you do in this book. So can you speak about really how you came to this idea to join again to this strategic mindset?
That's a very important question, because it was also the main biographical question for me. We talked about Heidegger before, and I love these ideas and philosophy, but at some point, I think you also have a responsibility as an intellectual. And I write about this in the book, the strategic mission of the intellectual. And our strategic mission right now is, of course, to develop the idea of remigration, which is the what, but also a revolutionary theory, which is the how. How do we get this idea to become politics? How do we get power? And the problem is the right is oblivious about power. Yeah. And this is a generational disease, because the original right was legitimistic. So they had the power already, thrown an altar. They were just defending it. And whereas the left on the other side, since more than 200 years, they've been done nothing but revolution. Revolution. They have an instinct for power. And every left-wing Marxist intellectual who writes a theory about Marxism has to come up with a theory of revolution. Who's the revolutionary subject? What's the revolutionary moment? And how will it work? If he doesn't come up with that, people laugh at him. That's something that's lacking. We have a lot of great ideas and all this religious debates, but nobody asks how do we actually get to power? What are the current strategies that people are using and following completely unconscious? So people are doing something, they don't really know why and how. And I really try to systematize the existing kind of strategies. I try to weed out wrong strategies. And what I did basically is I took inspiration from authors like Lenin, what's we done, from Gramsci, but I have to say even more from Althusser, which I think is a more systematic thinker. And I recommend people do not read Gramsci, Of course, you should read everything, but if you want to really understand metapolitics from the left-wing lens, read Althusser. I think it's way more systematic and way more easy to understand. But then also from thinkers like Gene Sharp. And this was for me a very important moment, because in our activism, I said, okay, we want to do metapolitical activism. So I will now read Gramsci, I'll read Benoit, but what does it have to do with the banner action? What does it have to do with the leaflet action, with actually building up a movement? I don't find anything here. There's a huge gap. And then I found metapolitics in action, this pragmatic approach from the American school, from Gene Sharp, from Trier Popovich, from Saul Alinsky, obviously. This how to do-it-yourself tutorials, how as an NGO, as a pressure group, you really can become effective in the metapolitical fight. And I mix all of this together and try to apply it to right-wing politics, and that's the book.
Yeah, and I found some distinctions, some conceptual distinctions very interesting that I think you took from Gene Sharp, or at least you develop it like this. This difference between the main strategy, different strategies, the tactics, the methods, and that's very important, because that's something really I had the intuition of that, but I really formalized it by reading your book. How important it was to accept the idea of a main goal, that there should be one main goal that will transcend, that will unify all the other tactics or strategies of the different groups, because obviously we are not all the same. We have different tempers in our spheres. We have more intellectuals, we have people of action, we have people in the media, etc. So of course we cannot expect that everybody does the same thing, but at least if there is a main goal, we can all go in the same direction, and without this notion of main goal, we cannot move.
Exactly. And without this notion of main goal, we also cannot divide our labor, because like building a house, that's our main goal, and then we can divide our labor. I prepare the bricks, you prepare the finance, I paint the wall, but if there's no main goal, it's chaos. I build a few bricks here, you put a little bit of paint here, and in the end, it's a complete wasteland. And that's what's going on the right. Everybody's doing what they want, what they like. Then there's a new campaign, a new trend, a new meme, and everything is like disorganized. And there's also this vision that Lenin basically always repeats again and again like a mantra in this book, What's to be Done. He said the people are there, the resources are there. If there was only the mind who would organize it, a few people who would only dedicate on organization.
Professional revolutionaries.
Step away from the daily routine, from the daily blogging, posting, leafletting, commenting. Look at the big picture and then only focus on organizing everything. Then he said we could change the country. And I think that's very true for the right. And with this book, I hope that people start to think a bit about like this in these terms. What's the main goal? What's the grand strategy? What are the strategies of the different parts of the movement? And I think the most valuable thing maybe is this 5 parts of the right-wing movement.
Exactly.
In which I always, if I look at a country, I want to understand the right wing there, I immediately make a table like of media, party, activists, theory, and counterculture. And then I list the most important influences, the most important outlets, and I have a very good map.
For me, it was also like a epiphany when I read this theorization, because of course it's always some notions that we know. It's like when Carl Schmitt says that the basis of politics is the distinction between friends and foe, friends and enemy. In a way, there's nothing revolutionary in that. We should all know it, and we all know it by intuition. But then you have one person, one theoretician who really formalizes it, and only then it becomes obvious. But it's obvious and original at the same time. And so this distinction between the 5 actors you mentioned in your book is very important. So maybe we can say it again for the viewers so that it's really clear in their mind. So we have the political party, which is the main political actor in a sense. We have what you call the Bewegung, the movement, so the activists, all the militants, we say in French. You speak about the counterculture. So how would you define this counterculture? Like all the people who create an aesthetic?
Yes,
for
I would say the counterculture is also kind of a bit of a category which doesn't fit in all the other categories. So when it's neither party, nor movement, nor theory, nor media, it's counterculture. But the counterculture has a different strategic task in creating a vibe, creating an identity based not on logic but on aesthetics.
Yeah.
And the most striking example, of course, today is memes. Yeah, the memes, the music, the subculture, drinking White Monster, all of this. This is counterculture, and it's very, very powerful. Very, very powerful.
Yeah, it's something that is, of
Also,
course,
sorry, like fitness center, training, you know, raw milk, all of this, you know, like the looks maxing. This is the counterculture, which is really drawing people in, because when you're young, you don't want to, most people don't read a book and then become right-wing. They see other people do cool things and say, I want to be like these people, look like those people, I want to be part of this movement. Yeah,
the counterculture is really what creates a mythology around the movement or the ideas. So the counterculture, in German you said the Gegenpublikum, I think. The new public opinion. That's what we say in France. So all the alternative media.
Alternative media. That's the best term.
So the réinfosphère or this kind of thing, and the intellectuals, the pole of formation. So people who will teach the theory, who will theorize also the action.
Is part of the strategic duty of the theory. So the book itself is part of.
Well, your book is really what makes the link between the theory and the action also.
In a way, yes, and like to make a difference between the alternative media and the theory, it's very easy. There was a communist thinker who said it. Okay, alternative media is few words for many, and theory is many words for few.
Yeah, I like this quote also. So I totally agree with these ideas that these are the five main actors, and that they are all very important. One part missing means that it would crush. But I have the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have the impression that so to speak, there is one clear political actor is the party, at least in our democracy, how it is organized today. There's one political actor, because the activists, they don't present themselves to elections, so the alternative media either. So to think politically, you have clear enemies that you want to fight, and you want to gain power. The only actor that can really have power is the party. So that's the political actors. And then all the other is the metapolitical sphere. They turn around the party in a sense. But for this metapolitical sphere to work, there need to be a coordination with the party. Official or not official, but at least there should be a synergy between them. From what I see, from foreign eyes, I have the impression that this more or less exists in Austria, or maybe in Germany with the AfD. Maybe, as you said earlier, the AfD didn't support you clearly with the remigration, but at least they didn't back off. So they might have some links existing between these different branches. But in France, there's a big problem with the Rassemblement National, is that, I mean, I don't want to criticize this party too much. Of course, it's the main party, and I'm pragmatic. If I were French, it's the election between Macron and the Rassemblement National, I would vote for this party, of course. But I have the impression that this party refuses any link with the alternative medias, with the activists. They don't support it. And how is it possible for French people to really have an effective metapolitical fight if we don't have this connection with the party? Because the notion itself of metapolitics that the new right took from Gramsci is clear on that subject. Gramsci is not like create ideas and ideas will be effective by themselves. Gramsci was an organic intellectual of the Communist Party.
Exactly.
And so we need to have that kind of model. And how to do it when the main right-wing party, the main identitarian party, doesn't accept it?
That's a very good question, and also a very important point. It was Guillaume Fay who wrote about it in Archaeofuturism. He called it metapolitics in the void.
Yeah.
So metapolitics, which is not attached to the political fight of a political party, is basically, you could say, political masturbation. It's nice, but it has no real effect.
That's true.
It has no instinct of power. So you have this political party, and obviously, if you have no influence on the party, then you're failing in your job. I don't think that the way how all of these five parts work together is by creating a secret council. So in the ideal version, there's this one grand strategy: remigration, metapolitics, and political power. And then there are the sub-strategies of all of these 5 parties who follow along. And the sub-strategy of the party, the political party, obviously would be to cooperate and work together with the metapolitical actors. And if this, the way to ensure this would be to create a strategic consciousness in the party. A strategic consciousness in all of these actors, that they would go in this right direction. How do you create this without having a secret circle? By public critique, by public strategic discourse that you need to start, but also by personal contacts you need to take with the party intellectuals. So there always are some party intellectuals. You need to find out who they are. There always is a party intellectual academy. And there are always people in the party who are open and interested in such ideas. So it would be to create contact with them, establish contact with them, try to open a public discourse, a public critical discourse with them, a debate about strategy. And the other way, I think, is if the party doesn't want to learn, then you have to create a united block of activism, of media, alternative media, of counterculture, which is too strong for the party to ignore, together with a theory. So then, if the party just completely is isolated, then you just have to create a synergy outside of the party and make it so strong in a way that the party cannot ignore it. And I think in France, the chances for this are very huge. Like the Reconquête party showed that there's a huge potential for that. It was also unfortunate because it was basically betting everything on one card and then losing this election very closely. The vote utile, switched sides.
There was many effects because it was the war in Ukraine, there was the vote utile.
But this obviously takes some time to recover from. Because if we, for example, would create an identitarian party in Austria right now, we'd have one shot. Because immediately the Freedom Party would go into attack mode. They would be enemies, we would be conquering, we would take away their jobs, their livelihood, their money, their identity. It would be war. And it takes a while till the party and everything can recover from this war. And it was a war. I mean, it was not nice between also Le Pen and Zemmour. So I think the only answer to that is to understand where it came from and to try to heal these wounds. As you said, not attack them too much doesn't have any positive effect if there's no viable alternative, and to focus very much on alternative media, on activism and on theory instead, and try to create a synergy, a unity there that then slowly and steadily puts pressure on the party to open up again, to start a strategic dialogue again.
Yes, I agree with you, especially from a theoretical point of view, but concretely I have some doubts or some questions, because in the French sphere, probably you have a similar debates also in the Germanic sphere, but I have the impression the division is harsher in the French sphere between what we call souverainiste and identitaire. So souverainiste, of course, these are labels and they can always be some kind of caricature, but just to sum up, I would say that souverainiste, for them, the main goal is leave the EU. It's really the most important things to do. And the identitarians, for them, the main goal is remigration. Of course, I can hear that some people say we are both. We are souverainist and identitaire. But as a sphere, the souverainist sphere really insists more on leaving the EU, and a lot of figures actually are not so much in favor of remigration because they defend civic conception of nationality, etc. And without a clear party that embodies this idea of remigration, how to create this synergy, how to really focus on one main goal. And I don't see any alternative. What I see is more clash between these groups, a big divorce. You know?
So I agree. If the party really doesn't share our goal, then it's not part of our movement. They would be maybe not an enemy, but also not really part of our structures. And if this party doesn't exist, then you're in an unfortunate situation. But this was a situation of the right wing in the UK for decades, because they had no party representing them. So they only had the metapolitical field, and now suddenly they were able to create this party. Maybe it's a possibility to recreate it, but also I wouldn't go so far, because I think that the Rassemblement National is not comparable to Reform or to the CDU. And I think a lot of them is just tactics and pure pragmatism, which obviously is a wrong strategy. But then I would say the real hour of decision would come when they're really elected into power. So maybe grant them now their pragmatic focus on sovereignism and not touching the term remigration, because it's tainted from evil Austrians like myself, and there's the trauma from Zemmour, okay, well, but if they really get in power, then your work starts as a lobbying organization, with petitioning, with creating constructive criticism by reenactive action, like representative acting, like when we closed down the border pass with Damien Rien, the action, the French Alps, and the amazing identitarian activist Thais Escuffon. It was all the people together. It was the prime of GI. Even Macron then was forced by the public pressure to act and to shut down this border pass after our action in the Alps. So this kind of activism then would work very well, and then it would be the hour of decision, and then also it would be a window of opportunity, if needed, to create a right-wing party again, which is in opposition of this party right now. So at the moment, maybe you have to swallow this bitter pill that this party isn't really reflecting the ideas, but this means to get as strong as possible outside of the party. And as an NGO, there's a lot of scientific work on that. As an NGO, your target audience is always the core base of the party. So you need to identify who are the 10% core voters, the idealists, to do all the groundwork for the party. And this is your core audience. If you really get them. And what I also would go into, if I was in France, I would go into it's called grassroots constituency lobbying, where you motivate people from the party to write emails and letters and phone calls to their own politician, encouraging them to, for example, talk about remigration. First, you need to get the data. And there are a lot of lobbying organizations in the USA who get the data from Democratic and Republican voters by polls, by online petitions, their emails, and then they encourage them to put pressure on their own politicians, and it works like a charm. These are things where you can activate the party base to encourage the party as a catalyst to keep them in the right way without openly criticizing them. Because the open criticism, I really hate it. I dislike it. I do it as rarely as possible. It only creates drama. Only the left likes it. That's not the way how to influence a party in a positive way.
Okay, I see. And concerning in the metapolitical sphere itself, I mentioned the souverainists, but let's say it could be other people who are in the right scene but who don't share the remigration goal. What strategy would you recommend? Do you recommend clear opposition, clear fight, or something trying to be conciliant?
But you mean like what would be their goal then if they don't share remigration? How are they even right wing? So I mean
that's a question for me. But
are they like, I would say everybody who's in the right wing at least also in a way likes remigration. Maybe they have a different term for it. Maybe they have a different degree of remigration, so they call it a different way. But they all have a certain shade of remigration. And for example, like I would say there are different ideological camps in the right. Let's say libertarian right. So the libertarian right-wing people, they are against the state, they're against taxes, they're for minarchism and anarcho-capitalism, Rothbard, Mises, Hayek, but also they want to preserve the ethno-cultural continuity. The question, which goal has the priority? If they would have to decide in a goal conflict, a resource conflict, do I, for example, give 5,000 to a libertarian foundation or to an identitarian one? This is the Auf decision, the Ernstfall, so to say. But I think it's okay to work together with them if they also share our idea of remigration, and the same counts for more socialist thinkers. But people who don't share the idea of remigration at all, who have a different idea, I think they are not right-wing, because
so we should accept clear opposition.
Yes, absolutely. If your core goal is not the preservance of the ethno-cultural continuity, then you're not a right-winger. You have a different goal. There might be an alliance. We can do an alliance with people who have a completely different goal, but it needs to be a conscious alliance. We are grounded, temporary, and only very limited, and in a way that we get out of it with more power and they go out of it with less power.
Okay, I see. We will slowly go to the end of the emission, but I have maybe 2 or 3 last questions I would like to ask you. You have a long experience in the right sphere and the right scene. If you had to do, like Dominique Venner, write your own critique positive of the right sphere, what would you be? What would it be? What are the main things the right does wrong, according to you?
Maybe
in Austria or in general?
Maybe at some point I'll have the time, if you understand I tried it a bit also with this book, and I can also reiterate here. I think it's the lack of sense of power. So they don't have the smell of power. The right is not focused on power. That's very unfortunate. Then the right is very often focused on minuscule differences. So they don't have this general idea of solidarity with everybody who's in our camp, who is fighting for us, but they always create these small, little, tiny differences in which they then want to profile themselves and create purity spirals. So I think that's one of the main errors. And the third main error, I would say, is also this idea of narcissism, aestheticism, posing,
aestheticism, I agree.
Dying a beautiful death, just, making a name out of yourself, this, I would say, misguided heroism. And that's also something which is a big problem on the right, especially today.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I often say that the problem, the deviation that many leftists have is more that they think of moral instead of politics. But the one we have in the right wing is aestheticization. Like what would be more important for many people is the look of our fight, the posture, which in a sense we can understand. I mean, you even yourself, you spoke at the beginning that what attracted you in the right sphere was the right ideas of heroism, defending your values, etc. And that is good in one sense, of course. But as you said, we should not forget the political mindset, the thinking of power. And that is something that I too often see also.
It's a responsibility we have for the whole community. And this aestheticism, very often paired with a wrong and misguided idea of being an elite and snobism, that's, I think it's misguided because the core of beauty is truth. And truth also has a connection to duty, and politics is the duty for the state that we have as men, and that's also the core of my work, and that's why I wrote this book, because I think we have this duty as intellectuals. That's also a big problem, the trahison de clerc. I should even mention the fourth issue. The right intellectuals, they are not using their intellectual capacity, which is either a gift from the genetics or a gift from the education and the parents. So obviously, I don't want to say like Hillary Clinton, you don't build this, or Obama, but it's always something you inherit from someone. And it gives you responsibility. And this needs to be used from right-wing intellectuals to build up right-wing theory, a right-wing strategy. And most people, right-wingers who go to university, study law, economy, they choose areas which give them a good income, which give them the possibility to save themselves and their family, to create a little island of wealth, but they detach themselves from the movement. And in the movement, and also in the alternative media, the density of real intellectuals is not very high. And that's why there's a lack of strategy, there's a lack of direction, and there's a lack of professionalism.
And I have one last question. What would you say to somebody on the right scene who comes to you and say, Martin, it's over, there's no hope anymore, the great replacement is too big, we cannot do anything? What would be your answer?
One of my favorite quotes is "Dum spiro spero" from Cicero, which means as long as I breathe, I hope. And I think this is absolutely wrong, and you don't have the right to say this before we have tried everything. And we have not tried everything. We have not even tried 10% of what's possible in terms of strategies, in terms of organization. Like there's so much energy there, so much resources which are laying around unused. There are millions of euros floating around in Europe which would go to right-wing causes if you establish the fundraising networks. There's so many ideas, so many young men. Millions of people want to do something with their time, but there's no package. There's no organization to create this grassroots activism there. So I think it really just lacks the organizers. And for me, the patriotic movement in Europe is like an engine with 150 horsepower driving 30 kilometers per hour. So we just need to step on the gas. And before we haven't tried this, in this time frame where remigration is still possible, we don't have the right to complain or say it's over.
I totally agree with you. So that will be the final words of this interview. Martin, I really enjoyed doing this interview with you. Thank you very much. Maybe, yes, one last question. How to follow you on internet or follow your actions? I think you're very active on Twitter, on Telegram. I think you are banned from Instagram, you're not there. But do you recommend some pages also to follow you on these different networks?
X would be the best, because I'm banned on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. I was debanked 160 times, so I'm very, very much censored. But
I hope this video will not be censored.
No, I think you can interview me.
Yeah.
They are not deleted, but my YouTube channel, it was a big paid channel in Germany, was deleted. And still, you know, more in it. Yeah, I really liked it. But I also think you should support his work. I think it's a great channel. And I also really want to tell you, I watch it from time to time to amp up my French a bit, you know. And it's very unique. It doesn't exist in the Germanosphere, unfortunately, a great channel like that. And I really appreciate what you're doing. And I thank you very much also for spreading these ideas and terms in the Francosphere.
Thank you very much, Martin. So thank you for watching this interview. Don't forget to put a like under the video to help the people to see it. And don't hesitate to write a comment under. I think Martin and I will be very interested to read you. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Au revoir.